Racist millionaire falls in love with his baby's black nanny. Hello, dear friend. We are so thrilled to have you here with us at Alcott Stories. Whether you're a long-time fan or new to our world, you've just stepped into a place where heartwarming stories, deep emotions, and unforgettable journeys unfold. Get ready for tales that touch your soul, stories that make you laugh, cry, and believe in the magic of love and humanity. If you're ready to dive into more of these beautiful adventures, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss out on the next chapter of our shared journey. Thank you for being part of this community. Let's create memories together. Subscribe now, and let's start this amazing adventure. Jonathan Whitmore's mansion stood at the top of a secluded hill just outside Atlanta, Georgia, a sprawling structure of cold marble, towering columns, and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in light but held no warmth. It was the kind of home that photographers loved and people envied from a distance, but once inside, the silence was deafening, and the air was always just a little too still. It was as if the walls themselves had never learned to echo laughter. Jonathan, a self-made millionaire with sharp blue eyes and a chiseled jawline, had long believed success was measured in numbers, accolades, and exclusivity. He drove cars that cost more than most homes. His suits were custom-tailored by Italian hands, and his name on business cards sent shivers through boardrooms. But none of it filled the ever-widening void inside him. Beneath his polished exterior lay decades of carefully nurtured prejudice, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers in dinner conversations and tightens in the chest when certain names are mentioned. He had grown up in a home where black skin was synonymous with inferiority, where those people were only ever seen through a lens of suspicion or control. His father, William Whitmore, had been a powerful man with a dangerous smile, the kind of man who hosted politicians at one table and ranted about racial purity at another. Jonathan, as a boy, absorbed those lessons like scripture, learning early that his world was not just privileged, but protected by invisible lines he was never to cross. Madison, his ex-wife, had fit perfectly into that image. Blonde, graceful, obedient in public, and praised in Southern society circles for her beauty and her bloodline. Marrying her had been less about love and more about completing the aesthetic, a modern plantation dream for a man who still clung to archaic beliefs. But behind closed doors, their marriage had been a gallery of emotional neglect and quiet resentment. Madison had always been restless, and after giving birth to their daughter, Lily, her dissatisfaction grew louder. Motherhood never suited her. The baby's cries annoyed her, the loss of her figure enraged her, and Jonathan's emotional absence solidified her plan to escape. One warm Sunday morning, without warning, she was gone. No note, no confrontation, just an empty closet, an unanswered phone, and a newborn left in a crib that suddenly felt too big for the room. She had run off with a yoga instructor 10 years younger, leaving Jonathan in the pristine hell he'd created. For the first time, the man who'd built empires couldn't solve the simplest problem: how to care for a baby. He stared at Lily like she was some fragile creature he might break just by looking too long. Her cries were unfamiliar sirens that shook his carefully managed world. The staff tried to help, but none were trained for this. Diapers, bottles, swaddling, it was a foreign language to him. In the silence of the nursery, with soft pink walls and a ceiling painted with clouds, Jonathan found himself drowning in a sea of helplessness and rage. Rage at Madison, rage at himself, rage at a world that didn't bend to his control. And beneath it all, a strange, gnawing fear that maybe he was the one who had truly been abandoned. The baby needed care, and Jonathan, ever the pragmatist, turned to his assistant and barked a simple order. "Find me someone. Anyone. I don't care how much it costs." But what he didn't know then, what the cold walls of his mansion couldn't prepare him for, was that the woman who would walk through his doors wasn't just going to care for his child. She was going to dismantle everything he thought he knew about life, about love, and about the boundaries he'd been taught never to cross. Jonathan's words still echoed in the air like an aftershock. "Find me someone. Anyone. I don't care how much it costs." And within hours, his personal assistant, Carla, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd managed his life with military precision for the last 5 years, compiled a short list of potential nannies sourced from elite agencies across Atlanta. Jonathan reviewed the profiles with cold detachment, skimming through credentials, dismissing faces, uninterested in smiles, frozen in headshots, and bios that read like marketing pitches. He wasn't looking for connection or comfort, just competence, maybe even silence. He didn't want someone who'd ask questions or make conversation. He wanted an employee, someone invisible, disposable. By the 3rd round of interviews, he was already exhausted, seated stiffly in the living room that felt more like a showroom than a home, his mind drifting between resentment and regret. One after another, the candidates entered, poised, well-dressed, practiced in their answers, and all painfully unimpressive in Jonathan's eyes. Then the last woman walked in, and the room seemed to change with her entrance. She moved with the kind of grace that wasn't rehearsed, as if she carried her own kind of gravity. She was tall, with skin the color of warm mahogany, eyes that shimmered like deep pools of knowing, and curls gathered into a bun that somehow looked regal. She wore a simple navy blue dress and flats, no makeup, no jewelry, and yet something about her felt quietly radiant. Her name was Amara Lewis, 26, a certified childcare specialist with years of experience, a degree in early childhood development, and a resume glowing with praise from families who described her as a gift to our home and the calm in our chaos. But none of that mattered to Jonathan. The moment he registered the color of her skin, his jaw clenched, and something bitter rose in his throat like bile. His eyes hardened. "We're done here," he said flatly, not even bothering to look her in the eye. Carla flinched slightly, uncomfortable, but said nothing. She'd seen glimpses of this side of Jonathan before, and it always left her speechless. Amara, however, didn't flinch. She didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't demand to be seen. She simply turned to leave, shoulders straight, expression unreadable. But just then, Lily began to cry. A piercing, heart-wrenching wail that sliced through the walls like an alarm. Carla looked toward the nursery instinctively, but before she could move, Amara was already in motion. Without permission, without hesitation, she walked swiftly toward the sound, her footsteps sure and soft at once. Jonathan stood, stunned, about to yell, but something in her presence paused him. In the nursery, Amara approached the crib, where Lily squirmed and screamed, her tiny fists balled tight, her face red from distress. With the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, Amara scooped the baby into her arms, cradled her close to her chest, and whispered a lullaby. Not just words, but a rhythm, an old spiritual hum that wrapped the room in calm. Lily quieted within seconds, her cries dissolving into hiccups, her body relaxing into Amara's like it had found something familiar, something safe. Jonathan watched from the doorway, speechless. He'd never seen Lily so calm, never felt the room so warm. Something foreign stirred in him. Not admiration, not acceptance, but the first crack in a wall he hadn't even realized was crumbling. Amara gently patted Lily's back, walking in slow circles, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's scared," she said softly, not looking at Jonathan. "She misses her mother, and she's sensing your confusion." Jonathan flinched. No one spoke to him like that, not with such quiet truth. "I didn't ask for a diagnosis," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Amara finally looked at him, her gaze calm, unwavering. "No," she said, "but she did." Carla held her breath. Jonathan stared at this woman, this black woman who had entered his home, touched his child, and spoken to him as if she wasn't afraid of his power, his name, or his judgment. And the worst part was, she wasn't wrong. He didn't want to admit it, but something about her was undeniably right. He opened his mouth to tell her to leave anyway, but Lily whimpered in protest as Amara shifted slightly, and Jonathan's words died in his throat. "You're hired," he said, almost angrily, as if the words betrayed him. "On trial." Amara nodded once, unfazed. "That's all anyone gets," she replied, and carried Lily back to the crib with the tenderness of a mother and the steadiness of a healer. Jonathan watched them both, torn between resentment and something terrifyingly close to relief, unaware that this moment, this interview he had tried to end before it began, was the true beginning of everything. The air inside the Whitmore mansion remained thick with the kind of silence that didn't rest. It pressed against the walls like an invisible fog. And though Lily's cries had been soothed, the tension that filled the house grew heavier with every passing day. Jonathan kept his distance, retreating to his office or wandering the vast halls like a restless ghost, always watching Amara from the corners of rooms or behind cracked doors, studying her with guarded eyes and clenched fists, as if waiting for her to make a mistake that would justify the unease she stirred in him. He didn't understand her, not just because of her skin, though that was still an unspoken wall between them, but because of the calm she carried even in the face of his deliberate coldness. He questioned her constantly, with the sharp edge of someone used to slicing others down. "Where did you go to school again?" he'd ask with fake politeness. Or, "How did a girl from the South Side end up here?" Emphasizing girl in a way that wasn't casual. Amara answered every question without flinching, her voice even, her posture perfect, her eyes never lowering. Georgia State, magna cum laude, early childhood development, minor in psychology. Or, "I grew up with 3 brothers, learned to handle myself early." She never gave more than what was needed, and never let his condescension seep into her spirit. It wasn't that she was unaware of the tension. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the measured silences, in the clipped tone he used when asking her to do even the smallest thing. But she'd grown up learning how to navigate spaces that weren't made for her comfort. What rattled Jonathan most wasn't just her poise, it was her effect on Lily. The baby, who once cried at every sound and whimpered in her sleep, now giggled, reached for Amara, and slept peacefully against her chest. She thrived in Amara's presence in a way Jonathan couldn't understand. One afternoon, Jonathan found himself paused outside the nursery door, watching as Amara danced gently around the room with Lily in her arms, swaying to a soft tune she hummed under her breath. Lily's laughter echoed, pure and light, and Jonathan felt something sharp and unfamiliar twist in his chest. He should have been grateful, but instead he felt challenged, useless, replaced. Amara's quiet power unsettled him, not because it was loud or defiant, but because it didn't need his validation. She took care of the baby, yes, but also the house, folding throws in the den that the maids overlooked, placing fresh flowers on the dining table, cooking when the chef was off without being asked. It wasn't servitude, it was grace, woven into action. Her presence began to change the mansion in small, almost imperceptible ways. Warmth in the kitchen, laughter in the halls, light in rooms that had long been dim. Jonathan noticed, and it scared him. Some nights he caught himself standing in doorways, just watching her. The way she sang to Lily, the way she smiled softly when no one was looking, the way she sat on the floor to read children's books like it was the most important job in the world. He wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the familiar fire of judgment he'd been taught since childhood. But every time he saw Amara's fingers brushing gently through Lily's fine hair, or her hands rubbing her back during naps, something inside him cracked a little more. And yet, he clung to the cold. He'd slam doors a little louder, avoid eye contact, issue curt orders, like a man reclaiming control. Amara never responded with anger. She met every icy moment with warmth he didn't ask for, kindness he didn't deserve. The hardest part wasn't her presence, it was how it made his walls feel thinner, how it made him question things he'd spent a lifetime believing. Late at night, alone in his study with a glass of scotch and shadows creeping across old portraits of his father, Jonathan would whisper to himself, "She's just the nanny, just the help." But the truth was beginning to claw its way through the lies he'd inherited. Amara Lewis wasn't just in his home, she was changing it. And slowly, without trying, without even knowing, she was changing him too. But even as Amara's quiet strength chipped away at the thick ice encasing Jonathan's heart, the roots of his prejudice ran deeper than she could see, coiled tight around memories he never spoke of and shadows he kept locked behind the heavy oak door of his study. A room few dared enter, where liquor softened the edges of truths too sharp to face sober. It was there, late one night, well past midnight, that Amara found him. Not intentionally, but because Lily had been fussing in her sleep, and Amara had risen, as always, to soothe her. As she walked past the study, the flickering light beneath the door and the soft sound of glass tapping wood caught her attention. Something told her to stop. Something told her to knock. She hesitated, hand raised, unsure of the boundary. But something else, something human, overrode the instinct to retreat. When she gently pushed the door open, she saw him. Slouched in the leather armchair by the fireplace, half drunk, one arm hanging off the side, and the other clutching a glass of scotch with trembling fingers. His eyes weren't bloodshot, but distant, locked on an old black-and-white photograph he held in his lap. In it, a tall, broad-shouldered man stood in a military uniform, expression proud, eyes cold, the kind of man who demanded obedience and never tolerated emotion. Jonathan didn't flinch when he saw her enter. He didn't snap, didn't send her away. He just stared at the photo like it still had power over him. "You ever hate someone so much," he said slowly, voice gravel-thick, "that you still try to be them?" Amara said nothing at first. She stepped inside quietly, the fire casting long shadows on the bookshelves around her. She looked at the photo, then at Jonathan, whose mask had slipped enough for her to see the boy underneath, scared, confused, angry. "Is that your father?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Jonathan nodded, exhaling through his nose. "Colonel William Whitmore, decorated veteran, local hero, built this house, built the family fortune, built me." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Also built a hell of a doctrine. White pride, white legacy, white future." He sipped again. "Taught me the world was ours to rule, and everyone else was just noise." Amara walked to the armchair opposite him and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't interrupt. Jonathan glanced at her, as if daring her to judge him, but her silence unnerved him more than outrage. "I was 8 the first time I heard him use the N-word. He was teaching me to shoot. Said it loud and proud, like a lesson. Told me black folks were lazy, violent, stupid. Said they'd take everything if we let 'em. I didn't even know what it meant, not really. But I nodded like I was supposed to. I always nodded." His voice cracked slightly. "He made me read old books about race theory, gave me speeches to memorize, punished me when I cried, said crying was weakness, and weakness was for them." He didn't finish the sentence, but Amara knew what it meant. "He ever hit you?" she asked gently. Jonathan's eyes met hers for the first time, something raw behind them. "Only when I hesitated. Only when I questioned. Which meant often." He took another drink, then shook his head slowly. "And the worst part? I believed him. I really did. I hated anyone who didn't look like me, not because I knew them, but because I didn't. And I didn't want to know." He made sure of that. The fire popped softly behind them. Amara leaned forward, her voice still calm, still level. "And now?" she asked. "What do you believe now, Jonathan?" He stared at her, like she'd just asked the question that lived in his bones. "I don't know," he admitted. "I watch you with Lily, and it's like the math stops working. I was taught that someone like you didn't belong here. But you're the only reason this place feels like home. You're kind, smart, strong. You make her smile. You make her safe." He looked down. "And it scares the hell out of me, because if my father was wrong about you, maybe he was wrong about everything. And if he was wrong, then what am I?" Amara let the silence settle before she answered. "You're a man trying to unlearn poison," she said quietly. "That doesn't make you weak. That makes you brave." Jonathan looked up sharply, something flickering in his expression. Disbelief, hope, pain. "Do you hate me?" he asked, voice so low it barely registered. Amara met his gaze, her own eyes filled with something he hadn't earned, something he didn't understand. Compassion. "No," she said simply. "But I hate what made you. I hate what tried to turn you into him." Jonathan's lip trembled, just barely. He looked back at the photo, then slowly, deliberately, placed it face down on the table. The gesture was small, but seismic. Amara watched him closely, sensing the shift, the subtle unspooling of years of tight inherited hatred. He didn't cry, but his eyes stayed wet. "I don't know how to be different," he confessed. "Then start by listening," Amara replied, "and keep trying." Jonathan nodded, almost imperceptibly. The fire burned low between them, casting flickering light on two people who, hours before, had felt like worlds apart. But in that quiet hour, something sacred passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something better. Understanding. It wasn't the end of the past, but it was the beginning of its burial. The night had come in with an eerie stillness, the kind that fell over the world when a storm was about to break. A thick quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The snow started slowly, a few flurries at first, then heavier, thickening the air, coating everything in a soft, blinding white. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the panes like the prelude to a symphony of chaos. And then, suddenly, without warning, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the Whitmore mansion into darkness. Jonathan, already tense from the tension of the previous weeks, stood frozen for a moment, as though expecting something more violent to follow. But the silence that replaced the hum of electricity was oddly soothing. It felt real. Amara, always calm under pressure, stood up from the couch where she'd been reading to Lily, the soft glow of the fireplace, the only source of light. "I'll get the lanterns," she said, her voice easy, steady. Jonathan blinked, trying to shake off the discomfort of the sudden stillness. "I can't believe this storm hit so fast," he muttered, glancing out the window, but his voice lacked its usual edge. He felt human, and for some reason that unsettled him. Amara was already moving, her hands lighting lanterns, her steps purposeful, yet graceful. A quiet fluidity to everything she did. The fire crackled, its flickering orange light casting long shadows that stretched across the room. But the shadows felt different now. Softer, less menacing. "There's a storm in your heart, too, isn't there?" Amara's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone teasing. Light. Jonathan turned to her, startled by the unexpected insight. "What do you mean?" he asked, frowning slightly, though the curve of his lips had a slight twitch, like he might have been amused by her boldness. She smiled, but it was gentle, knowing. "It's just the way you stand, the way you look at things. It's like you're waiting for the worst to happen. Maybe you even hope for it, so it doesn't surprise you. But storms can't last forever." Jonathan's gaze softened for just a moment, a crack in his armor that only Amara would have seen. "And what do you know about storms?" he asked, genuinely curious, though there was a bitterness lingering beneath his words. "I know they don't last," she replied simply. There was a warmth in her voice, a steady certainty. Jonathan sat down on the arm of the couch, watching her as she continued to light the lanterns and arrange them carefully around the room. Something in her unhurried movements, her quiet confidence, drew him in. She didn't seem rattled by the dark, by the storm, or by the cold. She seemed at peace in a way he hadn't felt in years. As Amara placed the final lantern on the table, she glanced over at him. "Lily's asleep," she said softly. Jonathan looked over to the small bundle in the crib, her tiny form curled up beneath a thick blanket, her face peaceful, untouched by the chaos outside. "She's beautiful," Jonathan murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. It surprised him, how natural the words came. He couldn't remember the last time he'd let himself say something so unguarded. Amara smiled, her eyes lighting up. "She is," she agreed, sitting down beside him. "She's a little miracle." The room settled into a quiet rhythm, the storm raging outside, but not within these walls. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Jonathan felt himself relax. Amara made some tea, and they sat together on the couch, sipping it in the warm glow of the fire. They talked about nothing and everything. She told him stories about her childhood, about her brothers, and how they'd get up to mischief together, how they'd play games with makeshift balls made of cloth when they couldn't afford proper ones. Jonathan found himself laughing, genuinely laughing for the first time in years, the sound unfamiliar on his lips, but somehow freeing. His usual hardness, his usual self-imposed distance, began to slip away with every story, with every smile. Amara had a way of disarming him, of peeling back layers he hadn't even realized he'd built up over the years. He marveled at her strength, at her resilience, at how she faced life's challenges with such grace, such humor, such lightness. It made him feel small in the best possible way. And there, in the flickering glow of the fireplace, as the storm outside raged on, Jonathan saw Amara in a way he never had before. Not just as a nanny, not as a black woman, but as a person. A beautiful soul, full of depth, full of life, full of warmth. It terrified him. He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. He felt drawn to her spirit in a way that he couldn't control. It wasn't the superficial attraction of beauty, though she was stunning, or the convenience of a companion in his lonely mansion. No, it was something deeper, something that cracked through all of the walls he'd built over the years. She wasn't just a presence in his life. She was the light he hadn't realized he needed. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a split second, something inside him broke open. Something he hadn't known was even there. Something soft, something vulnerable. But just as quickly, he slammed it back down, locking it away, afraid of what it meant, afraid of what it could lead to. Amara glanced over at him, her eyes warm, her lips curved into the faintest of smile. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft, gentle. Jonathan opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He shook his head, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing," he replied, his voice hoarse. Just thinking about how quiet it is." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't the silence that was truly unnerving him. It was the way she made him feel, and that, more than anything, was terrifying. It was a feeling he didn't know how to handle, one that stripped him of all his defenses, one that made him question everything he'd ever believed. As the storm outside raged on, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow around them, and for a fleeting moment, Jonathan allowed himself to breathe, to feel the comfort of her presence without resistance. But only for a moment. Then he pulled back into himself, locking away the warmth that had threatened to undo him, burying it beneath the weight of his fears, his old prejudices, and his unspoken shame. The snowstorm had long since passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in white, but inside the mansion a new storm was brewing, one that Jonathan had not expected. The tension had been palpable all week, lingering like a cloud on the horizon. But when the letter arrived, sealed with Madison's unmistakable handwriting, everything shifted. It came in the morning, just as Jonathan was sitting down with his coffee, the warm steam rising into the air, and Lily was playing quietly in her playpen near the window. Jonathan had barely noticed the envelope until his assistants placed it on the kitchen table. The moment he saw it, a sick feeling gnawed at his stomach. He knew what it was before he opened it. He'd been expecting it, even if he hadn't wanted to admit it to himself. With trembling hands, he tore open the letter, his eyes scanning the words quickly. The letter, in all its coldness, was clear. Madison was requesting custody of Lily. At first, Jonathan couldn't comprehend it. He thought maybe it was some mistake, a miscommunication. But the words didn't lie. She wanted custody, but not for the reasons any loving mother might. No, Madison had found a new man, someone younger, more successful, more perfect than Jonathan had ever been. And she'd promised him that she'd be a better mother than she'd been with Lily. Her new boyfriend thought she looked weak, abandoning their daughter. So, she wanted to fix it, to show him she could be a mother again, even if it meant tearing Lily away from her father. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face, the ground beneath him suddenly unstable. Panic gripped him in an iron fist, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't lose Lily, the one pure thing left in his life. She was the only reason he had woken up every day, the only reason he had started to let go of the darkness that had held him prisoner for so many years. The thought of her being taken away sent a wave of panic crashing over him, suffocating him with its weight. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. His mind spiraled into chaos, the walls of the mansion suddenly feeling like a prison, the air thick with anxiety. His instincts screamed at him to fight, but he didn't even know where to begin. What could he do to keep her? He was alone in this, utterly alone. The coldness of the letter settled in his chest like a brick. As if on cue, Amara entered the room, carrying Lily in her arms. The sight of her, calm, composed, always present, somehow steadied him. But only for a moment. Her gaze flicked to the letter in his hand, and her eyes narrowed slightly. Without a word, she set Lily down in her playpen and walked over to him. "Jonathan," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What's wrong?" He barely looked up, still frozen by the letter. "Madison, she's trying to take Lily," Jonathan stammered, his voice thick with panic. "She wants custody, but not because she wants her. It's just because of some stupid thing her boyfriend said, and now I might lose her. I can't lose her, Amara. I can't." His voice cracked with the desperation of it, and his fists clenched involuntarily. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't back away. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Jonathan," she said quietly, her eyes soft but determined. "We'll figure this out. You'll keep her." The simplicity of her words and the depth of the promise behind them caught him off guard. He blinked, looking at her, seeing something more in her gaze than just compassion. There was an unspoken loyalty in her eyes, a strength that steadied him even as the world felt like it was unraveling around him. She didn't seem afraid, and in that moment he realized that she wasn't just there to care for Lily. She was there for him, too. She was already a part of this battle, whether he'd wanted her to be or not. "What do I do?" Jonathan asked, his voice small now, the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. Amara's expression softened even further, and she gently squeezed his shoulder. "First, you breathe," she said. "Then we start making a plan. We'll document everything, every moment Lily's with you, every call Madison makes, everything. And then we prepare for court. We fight." The words were simple, but the conviction in her voice gave him a strength he hadn't realized he was lacking. For a moment, it wasn't about the mansion, or the wealth, or the title. It was about Lily, and about the fact that he would fight for her. And now, he wasn't alone. "I'm with you," Amara said softly, as if that one sentence could carry all the weight of a promise. Jonathan swallowed hard, the storm in his chest still raging, but somehow a little less intense. He nodded, the first true decision he'd made in weeks settling into his bones. "Okay," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "We'll fight." As Amara began to lay out a plan, going over every detail carefully, Jonathan watched her, not just as the nanny, but as someone who had become the one constant in his life. She was loyal, steady, and in that loyalty, something deeper had begun to form. He didn't know when it had started, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing her as just the nanny. She was something more, someone who had fought for him, even when he hadn't realized he needed her to. And as they worked together to protect Lily, Jonathan realized with growing clarity that he might be falling for her. And that realization, though terrifying, wasn't something he could deny. It was the truth, and like everything else about his life, it was messy, complicated, and as uncontrollable as the storm that still raged outside. The morning after their plan was set into motion, the house felt quieter than usual, as though the weight of their decision hung heavily in the air, casting a shadow over everything. Yet there was a sense of calm, a strange peace that had settled over the mansion, despite the looming battle for custody. Jonathan had always believed that wealth, power, and control were the keys to holding the world at bay. But the previous night had shifted something in him, something he couldn't name or fully understand. Amara, with her quiet strength and unflinching loyalty, had unknowingly become his anchor. He watched from the study window as she walked out into the garden with Lily in her arms, her movements fluid, graceful, a quiet elegance in everything she did. The garden, once a neglected corner of the estate, had come to life under her care. The flowers she had planted over the past few weeks were now in full bloom, vibrant and full of life, a sharp contrast to the sterile, cold walls of the mansion. There was something symbolic in the way she worked with the earth, as though each seed she planted represented a small act of healing, a promise to nurture and grow something beautiful out of the chaos. Jonathan's gaze lingered on her as she bent to the ground, carefully planting another row of flowers. Her smile was soft, her attention completely focused on the task at hand. Lily sat nearby, picking at the petals of a daisy with a curious, innocent gaze. It was a peaceful scene, one that seemed almost too perfect for the storm they were facing. But as Jonathan watched, a pang of something he couldn't identify twisted in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was the sight of her so effortlessly at home in this world of dirt and life, or the quiet way she had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. But something in him stirred. The silence of the mansion pressed in on him, and before he could overthink it, he found himself walking toward the garden. The cool air of early spring was a welcome change, and as he stepped outside, he felt a sense of release, as though the garden itself was welcoming him into a space where things could grow, where there was room for new beginnings. "Amara," he called out softly, unsure if his presence would interrupt the peacefulness of the moment. She turned, her smile widening when she saw him. "I thought you might join us," she said, her voice light, with a hint of surprise, but no judgment. She motioned to the small plot of earth she had already worked on. "It's a good day for planting, don't you think?" Jonathan nodded, a small chuckle escaping him. "I'll admit I'm not the gardening type, but I can give it a try." Amara laughed, a sound that made Jonathan's heart unexpectedly race. "It's not hard," she reassured him, standing and brushing the dirt from her hands. "Just a little patience and a little care." He knelt down beside her, unsure of the proper technique, but willing to learn. Their hands brushed as they both reached for a trowel, and the contact, simple and fleeting, sent a jolt of awareness through Jonathan's body. He quickly pulled back, pretending not to notice the heat that had suddenly risen in his chest. He focused on the task at hand, trying to ground himself in the physicality of the garden, the texture of the dirt between his fingers, the smell of the flowers. But with each seed they planted together, a new connection seemed to bloom between them, a quiet understanding that neither could ignore. Amara moved beside him with ease, her movements fluid and graceful, the way she worked with the earth as if it were second nature. Jonathan found himself watching her, more than he was paying attention to the task, captivated by the way her face softened when she spoke about the flowers, how she treated each plant with such tenderness, as though it were an extension of herself. And when she looked up at him, catching him watching her, her gaze was warm, her eyes sparkling with that same gentle understanding that had drawn him in from the beginning. There was a quiet laughter between them, unspoken yet present in the way their hands brushed together once more as they planted the last of the flowers. The air between them felt charged, and for the first time in a long while, Jonathan allowed himself to feel something other than the weight of responsibility or fear. In the shared space of the garden, it was as if the world had faded away, leaving just the two of them, their shared silence, their shared task, and an unexpected, undeniable connection. As the final flower was placed in the soil, Jonathan leaned back on his heels, wiping his hands on his jeans, feeling the satisfaction of having contributed to something tangible, something real. He turned to Amara, his gaze lingering on her face, the way her skin glowed in the soft light, the way her hair fluttered in the breeze. For a moment, there was nothing else. The world outside, the looming battle for Lily, all of it seemed distant. There was only Amara, and this fragile, fleeting moment of peace. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, and then a slow, lingering smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Thank you for helping," she said, her voice soft, almost shy, as if unsure of how to handle the sudden shift in the atmosphere between them. Jonathan swallowed, unsure of how to respond, but his eyes locked with hers, and in that gaze, something shifted. There was an unspoken understanding, a quiet realization. Neither of them could deny the spark that had ignited in that moment, a spark neither of them had wanted to acknowledge but couldn't ignore any longer. "I'm glad I could help," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, and for the first time in a long while, Jonathan allowed himself to feel vulnerable, to feel something real. The silence between them stretched, comfortable, yet heavy with the weight of what was unsaid. The connection between them, so unexpected, so complicated, was undeniable. And as Amara turned her gaze back to the flowers, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder what came next. He had been so focused on protecting Lily, on keeping everything in his life intact, that he hadn't stopped to consider what he was allowing to bloom within himself. He wasn't sure where this would lead, or if he was even ready for it. But in the garden, amidst the flowers they had planted together, he knew one thing for certain. Things were changing, and no matter how hard he tried to fight it, this was one change he couldn't control. The night settled over the estate like a velvet curtain, wrapping every corner of the mansion in stillness, save for the soft, rhythmic ticking of an antique clock echoing faintly down the hallway. A hush had fallen over the house, the kind of quiet that felt sacred, like something delicate was taking shape in the silence. Lily had finally drifted to sleep after a long day filled with laughter, muddy hands, and tiny shoes coated in garden soil. A day that had left both Amara and Jonathan breathless in more ways than one. Jonathan had tried to return to his office after dinner, telling himself he had work to do, papers to read, strategies to draft, but his heart wasn't in it. His thoughts kept drifting. To Amara's laughter in the garden, to the way the setting sun had caught in her curls, to the fleeting warmth of her hand brushing his. He wandered the house aimlessly, the echo of her voice embedded in the walls, the soft scent of lavender she wore still lingering in the hallway. When he passed by the nursery, something stopped him, a sound so gentle, so hauntingly beautiful, it made his heart still. Amara's voice, soft as a breeze, was singing. He leaned into the doorway, careful not to disturb the peace within, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. The room was bathed in dim lamplight, a warm cocoon of safety and comfort, and Amara sat in the rocking chair, with Lily asleep in her crib, singing a lullaby so sweet it felt like a balm to every wounded part of him. Her voice carried something ancient and maternal, something no opera or symphony could ever mimic. He didn't dare speak. He couldn't, afraid any noise might shatter the fragile beauty of the moment. Instead, he leaned quietly against the doorframe, arms folded, eyes locked on her, like a man seeing color for the first time. When she finished the song and turned, she gasped slightly, startled by his presence, but then her expression softened, and a small, knowing smile curved her lips. "Didn't mean to startle you," he whispered, stepping closer. "I didn't want to interrupt. You were—" He trailed off, unsure how to describe what he'd just felt. Amara stood slowly, her eyes never leaving his, her hands gently smoothing the folds of her blouse. The air between them thickened, not with tension, but with anticipation. Jonathan stepped further into the room, his voice low, raw. "You have a beautiful voice." She nodded slightly, her smile fading into something more vulnerable. "It's just something I do, to feel close to my mother. She used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep." The moment was fragile, poised on the edge of something they both felt, but hadn't yet named. Jonathan reached out, then paused, his fingers trembling as they hovered near her arm. "You make this house feel less hollow," he said, voice hoarse, heavy with unshed words. Amara didn't move away. If anything, she leaned closer, her breath mingling with his, her eyes glistening in the soft light. "And you've stopped pushing me away," she replied gently, searching his face for something she wasn't sure she'd find. He wanted to say more, to explain the war inside him, the fear, the guilt, the longing. But the words tangled in his throat. Instead, his hand lifted to brush a loose curl from her cheek, his fingers brushing her skin like a question. Time seemed to slow, stretching between them as their eyes locked. their hearts beating an unspoken rhythm. He leaned in, so close now he could feel her breath catch. But just as their lips almost met, he pulled back, the old fear flashing in his eyes. But Amara didn't let him retreat. She stepped forward, just a small, sure step, closing the space between them not with hesitation, but with quiet, certain grace. Her hand rested gently on his chest, and she tilted her face up to his. "It's okay," she whispered, and then she kissed him. Slowly, gently, but with all the weight of what had built between them. The buried feelings, the late-night glances, the moments in the garden, the healing, the aching. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a surrender, a confession, a breaking open of everything they'd kept hidden. Jonathan responded, at first tentatively, then with a growing intensity that matched the swirl of emotions between them. His arms wrapped around her, like he'd been waiting his whole life to hold something real, someone real, someone who saw him beyond his past, his money, his mistakes. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any declaration, and in it, a shift had occurred. The balance between them had changed. Something had been crossed, something that couldn't be undone. Their eyes lingered on each other, filled with questions, with uncertainty, but also with a deep, unspoken understanding. Whatever came next, it would never be the same. But for the first time, neither of them seemed afraid of that. The next morning carried a strange weight, as if the air itself was heavier, thicker, with the echo of what had happened the night before. Jonathan woke with the memory of Amara's kiss still fresh on his lips, his heartbeat sinking to the rhythm of that slow-burning moment that had shifted everything between them. The mansion felt different, not in its structure, but in its energy. For once it felt alive, infused with something warm and real. He lingered by the nursery door, watching as Amara gently rocked Lily, her touch tender, her eyes distant. They hadn't spoken about the kiss, not yet, but it hovered between them like a fragile secret, too sacred to break with words too soon. But the moment of peace was destined to be short-lived. By late afternoon, the tranquility shattered like glass underfoot when his brother, Malcolm Whitmore, stormed through the front gates and into the grand foyer with the fury of a man on a mission. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in his signature navy suit and American flag lapel pin, Malcolm was everything Jonathan had been expected to emulate. Proud, powerful, and terrifyingly loyal to the image of control their family had cultivated for generations. His voice thundered through the house before he even saw Jonathan. "We need to talk. Now." Jonathan met him in the study, confused, but the moment the door shut behind them, Malcolm wasted no time. He tossed a folder onto the desk, photographs inside. One of them was Jonathan and Amara standing close in the garden. Another showed them walking side by side near the nursery window. Nothing incriminating, but enough for someone with a bigoted lens to twist into scandal. "You've lost your goddamn mind," Malcolm spat. "A black nanny? Living here? And now this. Do you have any idea what this will do to your reputation? To our name?" Jonathan stood frozen, the old fear crawling up his spine, the fear of disappointing the empire he'd inherited, the family name stitched into Atlanta's old money fabric. "It's none of your business," he managed, voice tight. "It is when your decisions drag our legacy into the mud. You're not some woke activist trying to make headlines. You're a Whitmore. Your business depends on your name. Our investments, our board seats, our partners. You think they'll stay if this gets out?" The words hit hard, calculated like punches to the gut. Jonathan looked down at the folder, at the blurry stills of something that was never meant to be public. His heart pounded, not out of guilt, but out of fury. But his silence betrayed his uncertainty. Malcolm saw it, and pressed harder. "Fire her. End it. Clean up this mess before it's too late." Those words echoed through the room like poison, curling around the edges of Jonathan's mind. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. His hesitation said enough. Malcolm left with a smug sense of victory, slamming the door behind him. Hours passed like days. Jonathan sat alone in the study, staring at nothing, spiraling in a storm of conflicting emotions, the years of conditioning, the weight of legacy, the fragile trust that had just begun to form between him and Amara. And then, as if summoned by the ache in his chest, she appeared. She stood in the doorway, not with accusation, but with knowing in her eyes. "He came," she said softly. Jonathan nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I heard him," she added, her voice calm, but behind it a strength that cut deeper than rage. She stepped into the room slowly, her back straight, her presence commanding. "You don't have to say it. I know what this is. I know how men like your brother think, and I know what kind of pressure they can put on someone like you." Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to defend, but she raised a hand, not in dismissal, but in clarity. "I'm not ashamed of who I am. I walked into this house knowing I was different. I stayed because of Lily, and because you weren't the man you pretended to be when we met. You were broken, yes, but not hateful, not truly. I saw someone who was taught to hate, but who wanted to unlearn it. And for a while, I believed you could." Her voice cracked just slightly, but her eyes never wavered. "But now, you're at a crossroads, Jonathan. You can't have both. You can't keep me hidden while holding on to the approval of a world built on fear and control." She walked closer, standing in front of him, heart open, unflinching. "I'll leave, if that's what needs to happen. Not because I'm embarrassed, not because I regret anything, but because I won't stay in a place where I'm a secret." Jonathan's breath caught. She was everything he admired, brave, unapologetic, full of dignity, and watching her prepare to walk away shattered something inside him. "You're not a secret," he said, finally looking up, voice raw. "Then prove it," she whispered. "Not to me, to yourself, to your daughter. Be the kind of man Lily can look up to. A man who chooses what's right, not what's easy." She turned to leave, her silhouette framed by the doorway, and he felt something inside him rise. Not the usual tide of guilt or panic, but a fire, a resolve. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not because of the chains of the past or the weight of someone else's voice. And as the door closed behind her, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the truth she'd left hanging in the air. Change wasn't safe. It wasn't polite. It was hard and painful and necessary. The hours after Amara walked out echoed like hollow drums in Jonathan's chest, each beat reminding him of what he stood to lose. Not just the woman he had grown to love, but the rare sense of peace and purpose that had begun to mend the broken corners of his soul. He sat alone in the dimmed nursery that night, watching Lily sleep with her tiny hand curled around the stuffed bear Amara had given her, and for the first time in his life, he cried, without shame. It wasn't the cry of a man who had lost control. It was the sob of a man who had finally seen the truth, that the life he'd built was a hollow shell, gilded and glittering on the outside, but rotting at its core. His father's voice haunted him. Sermons of division, of superiority, of bloodlines and walls that had kept him imprisoned in a false sense of power. His marriage had been a performance, a trophy for a life he never truly earned. But Amara had been the first real thing. She had entered his home with grace, endured his coldness with strength, and challenged his hate not with rage, but with unrelenting dignity. And now she was gone. And he realized he had a choice, the same one she had begged him to make, to live as a shadow of the man he was expected to be, or to step into the light and become the man his daughter deserved. So he made a call, a quiet one at first, to a former board member of a local black community center he had once denied funding to. Then another, to a journalist who had always sought interviews that he had refused. And then he dressed, not in his usual tailored armor, but in a simple coat and slacks, his hair still tousled from sleepless nights, his heart thudding like thunder in his chest, and drove across town to the West End, where a modest brick building hosted a community fundraiser Amara had mentioned in passing once on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. When he arrived, eyes turned. The crowd was diverse, vibrant, full of voices and lives he'd once dismissed as irrelevant. But here he stood, on the outside, looking in, unsure if he had any right to walk through the door. But he did. And when he saw Amara on stage, helping set up an auction table, her face froze in disbelief. He stepped up quietly, and when someone recognized him, a hush spread through the room like a wave. Without asking for permission, Jonathan took the mic from the nearby speaker stand, his palms sweaty, throat dry, but his voice steady as he looked out over the faces staring back, skeptical, curious, some angry, others unreadable. He took a breath and began. "My name is Jonathan Whitmore. Many of you know that name, not for good reasons. I was raised in a house where hate was taught before kindness. I built my success on systems I didn't understand, and I let silence make me complicit. I've judged people by the color of their skin. I've held on to beliefs that weren't mine to begin with, but I never questioned them. Until someone walked into my home and quietly showed me what it means to live with grace." The room remained still. Amara's hand trembled against the table, her eyes locked on him. "I'm not here to beg forgiveness," he continued, voice cracking, "because that isn't mine to ask for. I'm here because I want to change, not behind closed doors, not for applause, but where it matters, out loud, in front of all of you. And I'm starting by donating $2.5 million to community education and family programs in Atlanta. Not as charity, but as a responsibility. Because if my daughter grows up in a world that still makes people like Amara feel small, then I've failed as a father." A murmur spread across the room. Disbelief, shock, emotion. He stepped back from the mic, chest heaving, hands shaking. Amara didn't move for several seconds, but then she walked toward him slowly, the crowd parting like a tide until she stood inches from him. Her eyes were wide, her mouth parted slightly in stunned silence. "You really did it," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I meant every word," he said, eyes brimming. "And I'm not done yet." And in that electric moment, surrounded by strangers, legacy crashing down behind him, and a new kind of future trembling in front of him, Amara reached for his hand, not as a symbol of forgiveness, but as a bridge to something more. A future not built on regret, but on courage, healing, and love. The drive back to the mansion felt different this time. The iron gates didn't loom like prison bars, and the white walls didn't reflect the cold emptiness they once did. The house was still vast, still quiet, still draped in the kind of luxury that once kept people out. But now it was no longer just Jonathan's estate. It was becoming something else, something living. Amara stepped out of the car hesitantly, her heart fluttering in her chest like a bird testing freedom. She wasn't returning as a nanny. She wasn't here to fold linens or warm bottles or walk gently to avoid judgment echoing in the marble halls. This time she returned as herself, whole, unafraid, and standing at the doorway of love, not hidden, but fully seen. Jonathan met her at the front steps, not with some grand display, not in tailored arrogance, but in vulnerability. His sleeves rolled up, his face open, his eyes soft. "Welcome home," he whispered, and the words curled around her like arms. They didn't rush. He led her through the door she once passed under with uncertainty, now carried by purpose. Lily was waiting in the nursery, wrapped in a blanket of soft pink and the scent of lavender, giggling at her father, who tried and failed to braid her wispy curls. Amara laughed, full and rich, the kind of laugh that melts years of pain in one breath, and Jonathan watched her with the reverence of a man who'd walked through fire to stand in the sunlight. Then, without a single warning, without rehearsed theatrics, he took Lily in his arms and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You ready to help me ask the biggest question of our lives?" he whispered to the little girl, who cooed as if in approval. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. But instead of opening it himself, he placed it gently into Lily's chubby palm and waddled over to Amara with her, Lily giggling in his arms. Amara's eyes widened, hands instinctively flying to her mouth. But Jonathan didn't kneel. He didn't need to. This wasn't about submission or tradition. It was about offering her a future built on respect, not redemption, on partnership, not penance. He stood eye to eye with her, his voice trembling, raw, honest. "I spent most of my life hiding from the kind of love that heals. But you walked into my world and turned every wall I built into a window. I don't want you to just be part of our life. I want you to be the heart of it. Amara Lewis, will you be our forever?" Lily reached toward Amara with the tiny box, as if sealing the question with her own unspoken blessing. Tears fell down Amara's cheeks before she could answer. Tears not of surprise, but of recognition. She had waited her whole life to be loved fully, not in spite of who she was, but because of it. She nodded through the emotion, her voice a whisper wrapped in joy. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The ring sparkled, not with extravagance, but with meaning, as Jonathan slipped it onto her finger while Lily squealed in delight. There was no music, no crowd, no champagne, just the three of them, standing in the nursery where it had all begun, now blooming into something sacred. And in that quiet room, once filled with grief and shadows, love finally took its rightful place, not whispered, not hidden, but radiant and free. The garden was alive in ways it had never been before, not just blooming with the colors of spring, but humming with laughter, soft jazz, clinking glasses, and the energy of connection. Beneath the canopy of fairy lights, strung between oak branches and over, flower beds planted with intention and memory, Jonathan and Amara moved like graceful hosts of a dream they had once never imagined possible. Years had passed since that snowy night when everything began to shift, but time had not weathered their bond. It had deepened it, softened edges, and painted their days with meaning. Lily, now a vibrant, precocious 6-year-old, with her mother's brilliance in her eyes and her father's stubborn spark, darted between the guests, offering lemonade and handmade flower pins, proudly announcing that her family built this garden with love. And it was true. The same patch of earth where Amara once knelt to plant life had become a sanctuary for something far greater: healing. Jonathan stood on a small wooden stage at the back of the yard, one hand resting over his heart as he addressed the diverse crowd before him. Artists, teachers, business leaders, neighbors from across communities that had once seemed like different worlds. He held a copy of his newly published memoir, Unlearning Hate, My Journey to Love. The pages a mirror of transformation, a confession, a blueprint for breaking generational cycles. "I once lived behind walls built by fear and ignorance," he said, his voice steady with emotion. "But love, unexpected, relentless love, tore those walls down and showed me who I could become." Applause rose like waves, but Amara, standing near the roses in a soft ivory dress, smiled quietly, her gaze not on the crowd, but on him. She had never asked for credit. Her love had never come with demands. But in that moment, it was clear to all that she had been the light through which this legacy was rewritten. After the speeches, the music resumed, blending soul and blues and soft folk into a tapestry of joy. Friends of every background danced together. Stories flowed like wine, and under the peach-colored sky, the past no longer held the weight it once did. As the evening settled into golden dusk, Jonathan, Amara, and Lily sat on a quilt at the top of a small hill in their garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The child nestled between them, her head resting on Amara's lap, her small fingers tracing patterns on Jonathan's hand. There was no need for words. The silence between them was full, not empty, as the wind rustled through the leaves like a whisper of those who came before, and those yet to come. In that moment, surrounded by warmth, acceptance, and hope, they weren't just a family. They were proof that hearts can change, that love, when brave enough to face pain and dismantle prejudice, can rebuild a future worthy of its children. And as the sun kissed the edge of tomorrow, the Whitmore legacy was no longer one of wealth or whiteness. It was a legacy of courage, of chosen family, and a garden grown from the soil of redemption and love. Message for society. Love sees no color. Hate is taught, and it can be unlearned. We are not defined by our past, but by the courage we show to change it. Humanity wins when hearts are open.